Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the second day of our conference. My name is Cusick, and I'm going to begin this session as facilitator and quickly turn things over to my esteemed colleagues. And they will be introducing themselves so that you know a little bit more about them in their own voice. So our session today is titled Human Connection, Story, and Pedagogies of Hope. Rebecca Solnit, an American nonfiction writer, has written about human engagement with material topographies as a vehicle by which we encounter place and person. In this passage, taken from The Far Away Nearby, she offers us a helpful metaphor. She writes, "What is your story? It's all in the telling. Stories are compasses and architecture. We navigate by them. We build our sanctuaries and our prisons out of them. And to be without a story is to be lost in the vastness of a world that spreads in all directions like Arctic tundra or sea ice. To love someone is to put yourself in their place, we say, which is to put yourself in their story, or figure out how to tell yourself their story." In these words, Solnit engages the reader through the simple rhetorical device of a question, inviting the reader into her narrative and then proceeding to offer a metaphor by which to understand the very process. Stories are compasses, Solnit writes. They orient our steps, but they are also architecture. They are a vehicle of design, piecing together the parts of the whole for a common purpose. As teachers, our selection of text, written and visual, is a form of architecture, an act of interpretation. Guiding our choices is our belief in the power of story. This power manifests in the creative process, in the questions that begin it, the instinct of human response, and the connections between the two. And these function as a central guide for relational identity, for how the stories we inhabit reveal for ourselves and from one another how we are entangled in the world. Practitioners of genocide education must foster in students an appreciation for the complexity of history, teach the facts and consequences of atrocities, and acknowledge the emotional resonance of those lessons. If the goal of genocide education is to create a world that is so connected that such horror can never be repeated, then we must create opportunities for students to witness the transformative power of human connection. This panel examines how the research curriculum of Narrative 4, a nonprofit global network of authors, educators, and students who use the power of personal narratives to build human connection, to motivate collaborative dialogue and action, how this tool can serve as an effective mechanism to understanding genocide and as a concrete experiential mode. This morning's panelists are universities, secondary, and community educators who will share their related research, practical applications, and outcomes in partnering with Narrative 4 in the context of genocide, education, and historical empathy. As I mentioned, my name is Christine Cusick, and I'm a professor of English at Seton Hill, but also a coordinator of our 8-year partnership with Narrative 4. And so I'm going to begin this morning by offering us a very brief context for the work of our panelists, namely helping us understand better what Narrative 4 is. In Sunday's compelling keynote address, Alexandra Zapruder reminded us that, quote, stories are the way we make sense of the world. Similarly, in Nick Haberman's remarks yesterday on best practices for teaching the Holocaust, genocide, and human rights, he reminded us of the words of Mr. Fred Rogers' counsel on how to give voice to the weight of loss when he wrote, quote, anything that's human is mentionable, and anything that is mentionable can be more manageable. The people we trust with the important talk can help us know we are not alone, unquote. What strikes me about the conversations of the conference so far is that as educators, as humans, we are all seeking how to invite our students into the darkness of human history and present, while at the same time honoring the complexity of their humanity as learners and ours as educators. What our panelists will offer us today is their experience of using the core methodology of Narrative 4, a story exchange that you'll see enacted in a moment, as a pedagogical tool that reminds students that their voices and their own stories play an important role in navigating the complexities and also imagining a way forward into a more just and peaceful world. As teachers, we have listened to many student stories in offices and classrooms, but there are a few structures in place that allow us to honor them as knowledge sources, as guideposts for pedagogy. And so what we're going to do is just offer you a brief outline of what the organization does to try to invite student stories into modes of learning. So Narrative 4 is a global organization. As I mentioned, it's driven by artists and shaped by educators, but more importantly, led by students. The core methodology is a story exchange, which is designed to help students understand, as I mentioned, that their voices and actions are empowering to help them to enact change in the world. Narrative 4 celebrated their 10th anniversary last year, and the reach has expanded exponentially in the past 5 years in particular, reaching 4 continents, 35 countries, and 39 US states. The story exchange itself is fairly simple. It's sharing a true story from your life with one other person, listening to your partner's story, taking notes, and telling your partner's story in a larger group using first perspective. We then kind of move students and ourselves into reflection. The methodology is informed by research that talks about the role of perspective taking on how we foster empathy and increase empathy, and also how studying text, can enhance empathy as well. The combination of those practices is what's uniquely distinctive of this methodology in particular. Guided by 4 essential principles that we will invite one another to be curious, to use our imagination, to foster understanding, to implement and be present to deep listening, and then to turn that experience into positive action. This brief video, it's one of our earliest videos for the organization, but it gives you an overview of the mission and kind of the philosophy behind it. And I'm happy to answer any questions after our session if you have more questions about the work that Narrative 4 does.
Word of the brawl spread like wildfire.
What's for me to do? I'm just trying to finish school.
Coming home to that empty home is really hard.
But while I'm in labor,
all of a sudden a shark is coming toward me. But I was afraid.
We have to get it together, because life has no shortcuts, but lots of shortcomings that put small babies in young girls' stomachs.
I was 10 years old. I didn't cry.
This is the oldest thing in the world, you know. Since the days that we were like, drawing pictures on the cave walls, we've been telling each other stories. That's the essential spirit of Narrative 4, that we look at one another and say, I'm gonna tell your story. You're gonna tell mine, and you're gonna blow my mind open with my own story.
I'm glad that you're here. Thanks for inviting me to Chicago to do this. We're going to exchange a story about what got us into teaching, maybe, or some pivotal moment that kind of helped us into teaching and why we want to continue to teach. I guess I'll start at the beginning.
We tell each other, hey, you know what? You're valuable. Your story's valuable. I trust you. You trust me.
And obviously, I'm from the UK. I went to a Protestant school there called King Edward VI. It's like West Side Story, you know, for no reason. Then they were Catholics, we were Protestants.
wow, that was good. The next call that we got a month later was, hey, we want you guys to meet the President of the United States.
It's a great story.
Thank you.
Someone told me that Narrative 4 was like jumping off a cliff and growing your wings on the way down.
Our motto for Narrative 4 is fearless hope through radical empathy, where we sort of dwell in someone else's body, dwell in someone else's country, dwell in someone else's skin and mind for a while.
I came from a good start, and now I feel like I'm starting over.
The actual story exchange is intense, but what happens afterwards in the classroom is more important.
Narrative 4 gives them examples of opening up. We create an environment. That's what this exchange is about creating a comfortable environment to share feelings, share stories.
So today what we're gonna do is we're gonna do a story exchange. I'm gonna become him, and he's gonna become me. I was born in England.
And he said to us, do you want to meet the president? President Obama.
That's what Narrative 4 does, is to share that empathy, to walk into each other's shoes.
Not only are you
kind of stepping in one's shoes, but you're getting the opportunity to take a walk in them.
A great deal of it is listening, because once you're there with that person, all you want to do is listen to them. The narrative 4, we did it
Ireland, South Africa,
England, Newtown, California, Mexico, Connecticut.
You need to speak to someone who breathes the air of a different culture in order to have empathy for what they're experiencing.
The world needs narrative 4. The world needs what happened here this weekend.
If we can know that our story is valuable and the story of the other person across the street, across the ocean, across the wall happens to be valuable too, there are all sorts of things that we can do in relation to ideas of peace, ideas of belonging, ideas of becoming. To me, that's the essential spirit of narrative 4. Live your life out loud. Be raw, be brave, step into someone else's shoes. See what it feels like for a while to be someone else.
One team! One team! One team! Good job, y'all. It's homecoming. Let's get it cracking. Woo.
So the integration of this methodology, you're going to hear about some really fascinating research our colleagues are doing. But Narrative 4 has worked with organizations across the country to assess and do research about the outcomes of the integration of story exchanges. And the results have been indicative that it fosters empathy in the classroom, builds positive relationships, increases engagement, and enhances deep listening skills, all of which are crucial skills to bring to any classroom setting, but particularly when that class is grappling with really difficult content. One of the, I think, most integral pieces of Narrative 4 is the capacity for deep listening, for practicing that as an intentional skill of critical thinking. And what happens when students and faculty and staff work together to practice that deep listening is that it does create a space in which we can together not just navigate difficult topics, but also kind of bring ourselves into a place of agency, a place of hope. Lisbeth Lapari talks about how listening, once we change our thinking about what that does, we can be free to dismantle kind of the own boundaries that confine us to misconceptions of our own making about who we are, but what we do, but also how we might live peacefully together and with others on the planet. And again, bringing students into a place of agency when confronting really difficult texts can be really powerful. The exchanges can happen in all kinds of settings. I'll quickly move through. They've been both in person and virtual, which allows us to kind of cross some national boundaries. They most often happen in schools, in classroom, integrated into curriculum, in clubs. Often we have inter-school exchanges that bring students together that may not speak to one another otherwise. We have done field exchanges that bring students from different parts of the country into conversations. And the work has brought Narrative 4 into conversation with community organizations like the Parent Circle that brings together the parents of victims of violence. We've brought students together with police officers and youth, in colleges and communities to talk about a range of issues and also to integrate into specific curriculum, which you'll hear about today. And again, bringing folks into conversation, both sitting next to one another and across borders and boundaries. Just 2 quotes from students. We gather data from students about what that experience is like. And oftentimes students talk about what it was like to have somebody listen to them. A student once said to me, "This is the longest anybody's ever listened to me." And what that does to open students up to conversation and to serious study of really delicate and fragile topics. The other part of the story exchange, and one of the most frequent responses is that the experience helps students to feel less alone. And the research indicates that when we bring students into connection with one another and their space, then their capacity to be open to text and conversations from the history and from the current events that surround them is expanded. And that's part of what our amazing panelists are going to teach you all about how that's worked in their classrooms and their communities. And so I'm going to invite them to kind of come to the podium to think about what this looks like in the field, and then we can have a conversation about how it might be applied to your communities as well. Again, so I'm going to welcome my panelists, ask them to introduce themselves because they are amazing, and I'm going to step away. So thank you all.
So thank you everyone for being here. We're delighted to be able to share with you some pedagogy practices that we have implemented in our classroom. And even though we are university professors, we feel that these kinds of pedagogies can absolutely be implemented in a high school level. So we're very excited to share with you. I'll just introduce myself shortly and then hand it over to my colleague to introduce herself and to start. So I am Ronnie K. Odell, Associate Professor of Political Science and Global Studies and the coordinator of our department. And I teach in our Certificate of Genocide and Holocaust Studies as well. And I also am our advisor for Model UN, which deals with the global issues like genocide that we will be talking about today, and gives students the insight into some experiences that they may have never been able to experience themselves. So that's, I think, one of the most important points here, is to really understand what other people go through. And that's what we want to share with you, how we have tried to implement that into our classroom.
Morning, everyone. My name is Emily Wershesky, and I am an associate professor of English here at Seton Hill, and a big fan of Christine and Narrative 4. I've integrated Narrative 4 in my classes for many years and helped to organize quite a few story exchanges, and I'm always looking for ways to include Narrative 4 in meaningful ways in the classroom. And so that's what we're hoping to kind of share with you today, is how we've gone about doing that alongside some other pedagogical interventions. So the title of our talk today is how we can use simulation and story to help teach about refugees and migrants. And we wanted to start with just a little bit of context about why this is an important topic for students to be learning about. And so we pulled just a couple of facts from the UNHCR's website about just the sheer number of refugees and migrants in the contemporary world. You can see up here some of the facts. Folks who qualify officially as refugees under the UN's mandate would be about 31 million people. But there are many, many more folks who are displaced internally within a country. And most of these people are women and children.
Can I just say one thing, which is that I used to, when I presented this information, have the students try to memorize those numbers because they're such large numbers and so challenging, but they change so consistently and frequently, and unfortunately they change upward, not downward recent years. So that's just something to really think about, that constant change and displacement and the effect that it has on people.
So obviously with numbers like those, you could see why understanding more about the various refugee and migrant crises that we have in the world is important. But beyond that, having a sense of why it is that people are forced to flee their homes is an important piece to that, right? So some of the core questions that Dr. Odell and I were grappling with as we planned our courses were wanting students not just to understand the nuts and bolts of the crisis, so like the numbers and the mandates and the politics, but also to just understand that every refugee and migrant situation is different, and to act with compassion in policy making and thinking about the situation. You can see in very tiny font up here, I guess, this quote from one of our students last year that explains that a lot of folks don't understand that being a refugee is not a choice, and that is something that I think is lost on a lot of people, and part of what we were trying to address through our pedagogy.
So very shortly, I'm going to talk about how we prepared for this particular section, because Dr. Wazierski and I really wanted to make sure that we planned carefully, and we also wanted to know what the effect of our pedagogies would be so that we could improve in future situations or future classrooms. And again, very shortly, we had 27 students. Before we started the section on refugees and migration, in which we introduced the information, introduced the different pedagogies, and then went through a couple of simulations or active learning, we did an entrance survey and asked them what they knew, how confident they felt, and then we did all of the things that I just talked about, and then did an exit survey to ask them again about their confidence, their knowledge, and then assessing the impact of our pedagogies on this. So we did a statistical analysis, and I'll talk very shortly about that later. We also used qualitative content analysis. The students produced many different types of product, including essays and reflection papers, and we analyzed those to see what they learned and what they took away from the different pedagogies that we introduced. And I have up here that we utilized participant observation. We were a part of the active learning elements that we introduced, and while we facilitated everything, we were still able to see as it was happening what the impact was on students. So we spent some time on that. As Dr. Wazierski mentioned, we used pedagogical interventions to increase the knowledge, confidence, and also empathy that students would have toward the refugee and migration experience. I'm from political science, Dr. Wazierski is from English literature, and we used different types of pedagogies, different types of active learning engagements to show students the importance of the issues related to refugee and migration. I'm going to talk about the political science pedagogies, and then Dr. Wazierski will talk about the English literature. On this slide, there's a lot here, but we broke it up into showing you the different types of interventions, and that just means what we did in the classroom. I gave an overview of the literature on these topics, particularly related to global governance, international relations, and national laws on refugee and migration, something crucial and important to understand if we are to understand the experience of people fleeing or trying to find a new home outside of the state in which they were born or their country of origin. And the main thing in this pedagogical intervention, or the thing that we did in the classroom that I want to emphasize, is preparing and implementing a simulation. I implemented, with Dr. Wazierski, a simulation of the National Security Council. The National Security Council in the United States is responsible for advising the president on the kinds of policies that the president will pursue related to refugee and migration. So the numbers that are allowed in the country, the way that refugees and migrants are assessed to be allowed to enter the country, the places that they stay, the way that they go through the court system, all of that has a crucial and important effect on their experience. So the students actually did the simulation of the National Security Council and learned about how policy is made in the United States, and then created policy in this simulation and assessed their policy related to the narrative that they experienced. So that was the first thing that we did, was actually learn about these topics. The simulation that we used, in fact, is a really valuable simulation. I've used it many times. It's from the Council on Foreign Relations, and it's called Asylum Seekers in the U.S. Southern Borders. If you're interested in this, especially as an educator, I'd really strongly recommend looking it up. This one in particular is useful, but the Council on Foreign Relations has many model diplomacy simulations that you can use, and it guides students through understanding how policy is created in the U.S. government, taking particular positions in that policy, understanding different perspectives from different US government agencies, and then how the final outcome is chosen. So this not only allows students to really understand those policies, but understand how they're chosen and be able to assess and understand through various perspectives what's going on there. So as you see in this particular slide, these are students simulating the National Security Council working together to figure out what kind of policies are most important and valuable from their particular perspectives, and then coming together to decide on the policies that they would pursue or that they would suggest that the president should pursue. And so just finally, they went through this simulation, they created a policy brief, and then they presented it to Dr. Wazirski, and I acted as the co-presidents of the United States in this instance. It's very exciting. And they presented their policy brief to us. And then they created positions from themselves, their own perspectives. And then we essentially gave them feedback on and accepted their policy or told them where we would push back as presidents on particular items. And that's when we turned it over to the literature review or the literature pedagogy section.
Thank you. And I think that we neglected to sort of mention that our class, we were each teaching separate classes during this semester. And so Dr. Odell was teaching a course in political science on global foreign policy. And then I was teaching a literature class that was focused on refugee narratives. And we kind of were informally talking. We're like, oh, we're teaching very similar kinds of topics. Let's put our students together for, it wound up being about 6 weeks, and so that my students could get the global studies perspective and that her students could get the empathy, narrative, individual perspective. So a couple of weeks in, once students had started the simulation and come up with draft policies of how they would handle a situation at our southern border, we kind of paused and pivoted to thinking about this issue through the lens of literature and narrative pedagogy. And so what we did was a lot of reading. And you can imagine that for the English literature students, the first part of this module, which was very focused on political science and those sorts of disciplinary problem-solving methodologies, was a little uncomfortable to the English students who are not very familiar with them. So then the same thing sort of happened when we switched over to more of a literature perspective that was very unfamiliar to a lot of the students coming from a political science perspective. So as we sort of switched over to this module, we still, focused on learner-centered teaching. However, we did a lot of reading of narrative, personal narrative written by refugees. And then we also integrated several narrative 4 exchanges through this process. We began this part of the module with just an exchange between classmates in order to prepare them for the culminating exchange, which was an international exchange between and an intergenerational exchange between folks from several countries, including Mexico and Ireland, in which students and participants shared stories of home and were able to connect with lots of different people from around the world. So narrative 4 was a big part of this, but also the reading of several narratives authored by refugees. And this was one quick example of how we would sort of structure the class, right? So we would start class by listening to something that was authored by a refugee. We often listen to music and talk about famous musicians who were refugees, and then listen to a little bit of poetry. And this is just a quick example of one of those poems. It's called Running Orders.
This is Running Orders. They call us now, before they drop the bombs. The phone rings, and someone who knows my first name calls and says in perfect Arabic, "This is David." And in my stupor of sonic booms and glass-shattering symphonies still smashing around in my head, I think, do I know any Davids in Gaza? They call us now to say, run. You have 58 seconds from the end of this message. Your house is next. They think of it as some kind of wartime courtesy. It doesn't matter that there is nowhere to run to. It means nothing that the borders are closed and your papers are worthless and mark you only for a life sentence in this prison by the sea, and the alleyways are narrow and there are more human lives packed one against the other more than any other place on earth. Just run. We aren't trying to kill you. It doesn't matter that you can't call us back to tell us the people we claim to want aren't in your house. And there's no one here except you and your children who are cheering for Argentina, sharing the last loaf of bread for the week, counting candles in case the power goes out. It doesn't matter that you have children. You live in the wrong place, and now is your chance to run to nowhere. It doesn't matter that 58 seconds isn't long enough to find your wedding album, or your son's favorite blanket, or your daughter's almost completed college application, or your shoes, or to gather everyone in the house. It doesn't matter what you had planned. It doesn't matter who you are. Prove you're human. Prove you stand on two legs. Run.
So by opening with poems like this one, which is a very powerful first-person perspective on what it's like to experience a crisis of which you have no control and are being forced to flee, were some of the most powerful moments that students reflected on when the module was complete. A lot of them quoted from this poem the idea of not being able to find your shoes or your wedding album and thinking about what that must be like to have to experience that and part with things and people. The first-person perspective there kind of encourages students to put themselves in the shoes of somebody who might become a refugee. Other things that we looked at as a class were other personal narratives written by a range of authors. So sometimes we read some quick nonfiction, creative nonfiction essays, we read some poems, we watched a brief documentary, and students also played a video game called Path Out, which was a first-person perspective game. And so just briefly, kind of the reason why we chose to incorporate the literature approach to teaching about refugees is that that perspective taking that Dr. Cusick mentioned at the beginning of our session today, that what reading allows us to do is to imagine things that we can't personally experience, right? That perspective taking has strong cognitive effects. And also just that we don't often pause to think about the individual stories that make up larger crises. So during the time of our module, the conflict in Gaza was sort of beginning to unfold, and it offered an interesting opportunity for students to sort of pause and read some narratives and look at some personal stories of people who are experiencing that crisis and think about what it must be like to be part of that. And then, as we said, narrative 4 exchanges were a big part of this as well. So actually hearing the stories of people in the room and what their thoughts were about home, but also the international exchanges that we did as well.
So I'll just quickly run through this analysis and major findings section, and we'd be happy to talk about it a little bit more if you have questions. As you see, going back to those methods, we did several things to try to assess what the impact would be. And we analyzed using statistical analysis, essentially finding that student confidence and understanding of the issue definitely improved and increased. And while we didn't find the increase in survey analysis on knowledge and on empathy, we did find the increase using qualitative analysis. And I want to mention that after we did the simulation, the policy brief, and talked about from that governmental perspective how to think about refugees and migrants, then we did the narrative 4 story exchanges. We listened to these stories of actual migrants and refugees, And then we went back to the policy brief and asked, would you reassess your policy? How do you think about your policy now? And that's what we found was so important and crucial in the way that we taught this, because particularly with political science and global studies, you look from that high-end overarching perspective, you look at the 110 million displaced people rather than looking at the individual. And then from the literature perspective, you often look at the individual without assessing the macro level. So bringing these together we found to be very valuable and crucial for our students. And do you want to say something real quick about this one, Dr. Wizarski?
Yeah, it's so additional evidence that we have of students' changed thinking through this module about refugees and migrants comes in the form of, we asked them to define refugee and migrant at the start of the module and then at the conclusion. And what we found was that at the very start, students tended to put blame on refugees and migrants for their situations, using a lot of choice language, and then at the end, that pretty much dropped out of students' responses entirely. So they were using instead words like forced, displaced, persecution, asylum, and focusing on the reasons why people have been forced to leave home.
Essentially understanding the structural systems and reasons why people would leave their country of origin to a country of destination. And here's one particular reflection that there were many, many reflections that would have been useful, but we thought this one was useful to read. This is from a student. I do think that there is more we can do to help refugees at the borders and to be placed. I feel America should be putting resources and funding toward regional aid. It is not a preferred experience to have to relocate and abandon what you know and call home, what holds your ancestral values and history. This is the part we should be empathizing with and helping to rebuild these countries, communities, and territories by building a world where in the future there won't be genocide, religious or political persecution. We are creating a world for peace and prosperity. This was so valuable to see that students could then connect the individual experience with the structural issues, with the policy needs, and really try to assess. And there's at least one student in the audience that was in that course, so I wonder if that particular person might, during question and answer, share their experience. I don't know. But we've talked about the findings, and we're thankful that we got to the chance to share with you this particular intervention, and we'd be happy to share more with you. So we're very grateful. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Kim Sleeper. I am a high school English teacher in Lincoln, Nebraska at Lincoln High School. I do not have any qualitative or quantitative data, but I guess I can offer some sort of anecdotal data. I would say, I'm in my 5th year of teaching now, so I would say just the importance for me in narrative. I started out as an ELL teacher first and foremost. Lincoln is top 10 per capita of refugee resettlement, and my school is in the center of most things, and so we get a lot of those students that are coming in. And so as I was student teaching and as I was in my first year of teaching with ELL, a lot of students were opening up about their perspectives because it's very difficult for them to go into gen ed classes where maybe they've experienced some really horrific or very difficult things and truly nobody else in the class understands. But when they get to these ELL classes, it can just be a safe space where they feel like even if someone next to them has not gone through the exact same thing, that it's something similar enough and they can find some connection through that. And so when I changed to become an English teacher, I was looking for that really organic connection that already was happening in the ELL classroom, and how to help my recently arrived students in gen ed classes where maybe, especially with a language heavy class like English literature, help them feel more comfortable in navigating that experience. And so I came to the 2022 NEH Institute here at Seton Hill and got trained in Narrative 4. That was prior to me taking over a Holocaust and genocide literature class. But I would say that it was integral and is integral in the way that I teach it. I only offer, I'm just going to be very realistic, I only offer story exchanges to seniors. I'm not quite sure how to navigate it with freshmen yet and those kind of like wiggly 14-year-olds in my classes. But I will say that offering that sort of space in which students sometimes don't really know how to connect. There's students who are very candid about, like, I'm still kind of set back from COVID and I don't really know how to overcome some of those boundaries from that. They get with their partner, they listen to it, they come back and they're like, I didn't listen. And they're very honest about it, and we go through all of these sorts of things ahead of time of like how to candidly talk about this, but I think they have this moment of like, oh, this is what deep listening and active listening really needs to look like, and it's that kind of throw the baby in the pool sort of thing, but in a very empathetic way, because students take this responsibility, I would say, very seriously. They get very nervous, not necessarily because they're going to be speaking in a circle full of peers, but because typically they just feel the weight that I am carrying someone else's story, even if it's someone that I've never talked to before, because we're a school of over 2,000 students, so it's not uncommon for students not to know each other very well. And I would say I do a lot of narrative-based, what you were talking about, in my curriculum already, with just the pieces that I choose and how we interact with them, and I'll be talking about some of those things in my presentation after this. But I would say that I think that in the genocide and Holocaust curriculum, it's integral to have something like this with narratives, because students, once they know each other on a human level, even if they don't feel comfortable talking about academics with each other, it opens up that sort of relaxed aspect, so that kind of safely in, safely out, when we are talking about these really, really difficult subjects, at the end, they're still able to recognize that the people in the room they're safe with, they feel like they recognize, and that they feel like they're humans as well. Again, being honest as a teacher for the teachers in the room, I actually have not implemented story exchanges this semester in my Holocaust and Genocide Lit class because I've been juggling some other things. And I would say, just anecdotally, it has been a pretty marked difference in the way that students interact both empathetically with the material and with each other in classes. So I think that it's an extra call to action for me to continue implementing those and make that space in my class.
Hi everyone, my name is Harun Al-Haidar. I'm originally from Iraq, from the Yazidi community. I'm one of the Yazidi genocide survivors. And I come from same city, Lincoln, Nebraska, and I'm a grad student at the University of Lincoln, Nebraska, studying for my master's and focusing on storytelling. And my first experience with Narrative 4 goes back to 2017. That was like 1 year after I moved to the United States. And I got invited to one of the story exchanges there, and I did not know anything about Narrative 4 and how powerful that is. But when I got partnered with one of the students from Concordia College at Moorhead, Minnesota, that was after experiencing the storytelling and learning about someone's experience, and also me sharing somebody else's story in the first person. That was by far one of the most powerful experience that I had with Story Exchange. And just like one of the individual who shared that was the only time that they listened in their, maybe it felt listened to in their entire life. I think that was the moment for me. And coming from a country, coming from just survived the genocide, having someone to really listen to me and listen to my story and have the space for me to share my story was one of the most powerful experience and transformative experience for me. And that kind of, helped me to be an advocate and to encourage me to go and do some training to be a facilitator, so I can also not also be a subject in that experience, but also make sure that other people have to go through the same experience. And that kind of really opened up my heart and my mind about the stories of humans and their resilience and their struggle, and and how they really overcome the most difficult barriers in their life. And sometimes it's a genocide, sometimes a personal experience, but that's what's unique about the stories is, well, your stories might be as powerful as mine, and it's unique to you. And I think when we share with each other, that's where we really create that empathy. And when that empathy is formed, we really start to understand each other, to humanize our experiences. This was between 2017 and 2020, my time in Minnesota. When I was at the community college first, I said, I think I'm going to do this at my own circle. And I started small, and I did it with a couple of my colleagues, and started with one of our student government advisor to do a story exchange where just the theme was persistence, and with the students, how are they navigating their academic difficulties and balancing with their life. And after that, I did a couple other exchanges with the student at other university level. In 2020, during the COVID-19, I moved to Lincoln, Nebraska to be close to my community, the Yazidi community. One of the largest community in the United States is in Lincoln. It's about 3,000 Yazidis, and the huge influx of the Yazidi refugee started right after 2014, where the genocide occurred in 2014 by ISIS. That really kind of created a sense of advocacy for me to really utilize stories to advocate for the stories of my community. When through that advocacy, we're humanizing with each other, and we're creating a space where we really take some time to listen to each other's stories, because sometimes, even surviving from a genocide can create some difficult conversation with other people. But allowing ourselves to be immersed in the storytelling, and allowing ourselves to be, to seek to understand the other people's story, I think it creates a room for change. It creates a room for a process to unlearn some of the biases, some of the stereotypes that we have had about a certain group. And it's never a better space than that space that you've just created, sharing with your story with somebody else, and then they share their story with you. And I think that specific moment is extraordinary. And I feel like it's never felt in other settings and spaces, because it's so vulnerable. And it's so, you kind of at the level where trust is established. Like I can trust you sharing your story with me, and you can trust me sharing your story. And that's where a lot of our understanding can be formed, and we can civilly talk about some of the differences that we have, and also share some similarities, the common grounds. So my experience with Narrative 4 has been incredible, and I think that pushed me to go to grad school to focus on the storytelling and take some, learn some theoretical framework on how we can really understand ourselves first, and then how can we go and utilize some of those frameworks to bring people more together than divide them. So that has been my experience with Narrative 4 and with storytelling. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You can see now why I quickly sat down to allow them to take the floor. Our hope today was to also have a conversation between our panelists and all of you. So we invite questions, curiosities, anything that observations, so that we can just begin a conversation about how narrative form might be used as a tool, but maybe more broadly, the value of story integrated into curriculum and to community activism might be a powerful tool too. So thank you.
Go ahead.
So thank you all for sharing your stories and your experience with Narrative 4. It was a really interesting presentation. I'm just wondering about the way Narrative 4 works in a very diverse setting. Here in Western Pennsylvania, we have a little diversity, but obviously nothing like you have in Lincoln, Nebraska. So I'm wondering, are there challenges in using it in a very diverse setting, or is it even more effective under those circumstances?
I think that's a great question, and maybe one that I'm probably not going to give you the answer that you want to hear. Coming into my school, there's a reason why I teach at my school. We are already doing a lot of restorative, very narrative-based things already. And so when I got trained on Narrative 4 in summer of 2022, it felt like something that effortlessly built on what we were already doing. We do a lot of things called connection circles. We do a lot of talking with students. We do a lot of discussion on very difficult topics. We have open enrollment in Lincoln, Nebraska, and we only have one public school district, LPS. So there are private schools, and so students' families often choose to send them to Lincoln High because we talk about a lot of difficult topics. We do have a very diverse school, but I think that it's recognized, whereas I've talked with staff and colleagues at other schools, and I say, look, your demographics are almost similar to ours, but maybe just a little less international or recently arrived students. So what's the dynamic like? And they say, well, we just try to push people connecting, and you guys genuinely do it. And so I think that that's something that open enrollment really helps with. We are the oldest school in the city and one of the oldest in the states. So we also get a lot of legacy enrollment as well. So students really attend the school on purpose, I would say.
Hi, okay. And I totally agree with Cam about that. And I think for me, it's really, I want to get to a little bit more deeper in that. It's like me from an immigrant background. And in the past, where we have tried to organize story exchanges, like I did one in 2020 with a couple of my students for a summer program, where they're coming from a different, backgrounds, and and usually it's about the theme of the storytelling. And sometimes, like, when some people see the theme and they like it because they say, oh, they're curious, they want to know, oh, okay, I'm gonna have to share a story about persistence, or I'm gonna share a story about my story coming to the United States, or my struggle, or resilience. So sometimes it kind of doing like a little bit of a background about what the story is about, that kind of helps, eliminate some of those barriers. But, looking at Lincoln and Nebraska, it's diversity in terms of, learning about their immigrants and new American communities is somehow limited. But there has been a lot of great work been done in Lincoln as the new welcoming and belonging strategic plan, which I was part of and on a couple of the committees, is actually a great step on really raising awareness about the refugees and new American immigrants, and making sure that when there is a storytelling about this specific demographic, participate so you can learn about it. But most of the time, the people who are participating, they already have some sort of experience with immigrants, and we don't get pretty, like a pretty diverse demographic from, let's say, those who have not had any experience with immigrants or new Americans. So I don't have data with that, but there has been anecdotal data, like some observations, that only the people that we are in our storytelling, they're already interested to learn about us. they're already interested, they're maybe our allies, but I really would like to see from the other aisle to come, and I think that happened in Minnesota when I did one of the story exchanges, where there was a time that so Fargo and Moorhead, so I lived in Fargo for 6 months, and then I moved to Moorhead, just crossed the river. But in Fargo, there was a huge resistance to Lutheran social services, which was immigration organization. They accused him of, a lot of stuff, and then they wanted to shut it down. And there was one particular participant in that exchange, and who, I don't know if he was invited or he invited himself. He had a really strong, perspective of the refugees. They're coming here, that rhetoric that we're seeing now, and that they're coming, taking our jobs and stealing, not working, they're lazy, they live on welfare. So he came with that mindset. And then when he went through that experience, I think that story is actually online. You can find it. It's on the BBC. I don't know, I think you might have seen it, but it was extremely transformative, because that person's perspective totally changed. Oh, that's not what that's not what I was told, or I was informed. So there's a resistance to even going to that space, but I think maybe we need to do a better job, or I don't know, maybe inviting or reaching out to this individual where they can come and experience the storytelling. So
I will say really quick, I think I don't want to say negative experience that I've had with storytelling, but not quite as easy as teaching to seniors who are in a literature elective. The first time that I rolled it out, right after summer 2022, I was teaching a remedial senior level course. And so the majority of those students were below reading and writing grade level, had years of pretty negative experience in the school system. And so even though I reassured them this was not a graded assignment, where this is just kind of an extension of a connection circle, which is what we already do. I think that was a pretty difficult space for them to enter into, because they still saw it as just an extension of the school system. And so I would say that we never necessarily got to, even after multiple story exchanges, the first one is typically pretty clunky, and then you kind of figure out the group dynamic and what you're supposed to do. That one was never necessarily, we never really got to a spot where it kind of flowed really easily, because I think that students often struggled with opening up in the school space, because school, for generations and their family had not been a positive place. So.
And I'll just mention, in addition to coordinating our partnership, I have worked with the organization as a master practitioner, training folks as facilitators. And that's one of the reasons Narrative 4 requires that anybody who would like to facilitate goes through an intensive training module, so that they can be equipped to kind of identify a particular story exchange context. It's not a tool that you want to just haphazardly put into groups without thinking about the needs of that group, thinking about the goal of that exchange, adapting prompts for the stories so that they might have low stakes versus higher stake exchanges. And so there's a lot of work that goes into situating a story exchange in a community, particularly we never want to cause harm to individuals who are already either minoritized or kind of vulnerable within a space. We never want to put them in a position where they could be harmed through that exchange, even if unintentionally. So a lot of prep goes into situating the exchange and making sure those who are responsible for the facilitation, everybody up here has gone through the training, has the tools by which to navigate any of those difficult dynamics. And so it's not something that we just kind of drop into a setting. It has to be really thoughtfully done.
Low stakes prompts are vital. I'm just going to say that.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Something like we do object exchanges, which sometimes can be a low stakes, bringing an object that matters to you and telling a story about it. Even that just small piece of distance from the story, if it's about the object, somehow that can create a level of safety. I know of colleagues in this room that have done it internationally and in their own classes. So So it has to be thoughtfully done, and there needs to be time for prep. And I think for high school education, that could be a big challenge, is finding the amount of time to prep students and also have follow-up and debrief. So you don't want to just kind of plop it and then leave. You want to have that continued support and conversation. And in community projects too, so that's really difficult. But that great story exchange you mentioned is on the Narrative 4 website. Narrative 4 website's really helpful if you want to learn more. But the BBC did cover that exchange in Fargo. I used that in class a lot. And I can talk with anybody afterward. If you're interested in becoming a trained facilitator, I can connect you with folks.
I highly recommend that.
So I know that, especially like where I'm from, we don't really do this sort of stuff. And when we talk about these topics, they're not more so addressed in an empathetic way, but rather addressed in a memorize the information, put it down on the test. And I had never heard of the Narrative 4 exchange until I took Dr. Cusick's class this semester. So I really just want to know, like, if you guys think that this is something that should be articulated into our schools' curriculums from even a younger age, and trying to inspire that empathy from a younger age rather than the way that it seems to be addressed in our current medias and in our current American education system, where it's kind of just information presented to you in a manner in which you have to memorize and put it on a piece of paper.
I think that's an excellent perspective on incorporating that into the curriculum, and I think a lot of the not a lot. I mean, several, maybe more than several universities are already incorporating it into their curriculum, maybe their individual curriculum, not at the level of, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm saying is like from what I have experienced is mostly, a professor would incorporate that in their curriculum by really approaching it from a narrative approach and utilizing the story exchange on how to even create connections. And I kind of did that. I know like this storytelling model is about 3 hours and sometimes like 2 days. I've done both. And I've also done like 1 hour, which it gets more difficult because, but you can adapt and you can focus on something, but the true model is 3 hours and 2 days. And but what you're saying is really is incorporating this into like academic curriculum would really be not just like a personal preference, like I want to go and learn about this, or I want to just incorporate it in my life, but it's something that is taught at the university. Always systemic changes can have generational impact, can make a change, and it can sustain it. But always like the individual preference is always important, but not as much as if there is a systemic change when it comes to that. And I would definitely agree and also support to articulate this into the academic curriculum, because stories what will bring perspectives, because we talk about perspectives taking, because then focusing on that and focusing on people's story. I'm not only talking about the immigrants or new American perspectives or stories, but everybody's stories. That can shape the direction of the university, because that's coming from a genuine place and a genuine story, genuine experience. It can always have a positive impact. It really kind of takes us from the unlearning phase to a learning and growing phase.
I think the short answer is yes. In a perfect world, we'd be able to do this. But in all reality, and I can't speak to higher ed, obviously, is that we have a lot going on. And I know that, states are different with testing and state standards and stuff like that. But even in my school, one of my administrators, we have, I think, 7 administrators. So one of my administrators, he used to be an admin at a public school in New York City, and he had done StoryCorps several times, which is pretty similar. Just another narrative aspect, and I told him about this, and he was very excited, a principal as well, right after coming back from the Institute in summer 2022, and kind of thinking about, ways that we could possibly get the staff involved in training, and it just has kind of fallen by the wayside. I frequently will let both administrators know when I'm doing story exchanges, and it's not that they don't want to come. There's just so many things that are going on, and particularly post-COVID, we had quite a lot of fights and things in our school. It was really difficult, and so the principals were dealing with a lot of other things that were happening in the building. And as nice as it would have been to get in a classroom and see something like that, there were just more pressing emergencies that have been going on the past couple of years. And so I would say, in a perfect world, yes, but I think that even with buy-in, it can be really difficult. I know that sounds very pessimistic, but I think you have to have someone at the top, particularly if you do have to pay for the training for multiple staff, who is bought into that and not who is just telling staff, you have to do this, because no one wants to be told what to do about their job. But I would also say that even if, I think that, like, let's say if I imagine that we do a training for all the staff at my school, I think that most teachers would buy in, because again, just like most students are at that school on purpose, the majority of teachers are there on purpose too. But at the same time, that's why I haven't done it this semester. It's just a matter of time, a matter of plenty of other things. So, but I think that it's important to talk about ways in which that narrative can be incorporated without narrative for. I've worked really hard and I'll talk about it during our presentation, which is next, but teaching just via narrative, incorporating poems and songs and stories. When I teach about the Yazidi genocide, because it's perpetrated by ISIS, it can be really easy for students to, say, oh, look, another example of extremism in Islam. And so incorporating narrative, especially because we have, a high enough population of Muslim students from other countries, that I want to make sure that they're not falling into that rhetoric that they've probably grown up with. And so ensuring that we're first encountering narratives, poetry, different aspects, storytelling, children's stories are a really great spot to start with, and make sure that students are interacting with that first and seeing that, and then understanding that extremism is a separate story from that.
And I'll just mention, Narrative 4 has been responsive to that real demand of time and attention, particularly at the secondary level. And they're continuing to evolve different practices that are connected with similar goals, but might not take quite as long. So they're doing kind of minute exchanges, and they're working with faculty at the secondary level to think about how can we adapt this model for time restraints and curriculum restraints. The other piece I'll just briefly mention is why actual research can be so helpful is oftentimes, in my experience, when you have data that suggests the success or the viability of a new pedagogical tool, those who have the power to decide about curriculum or time or resources or more easily buy into it and invest in it. So the evolving research that Narrative 4 is doing, and that teachers like we have here that are doing, is really, I think, can be crucial to establish buy-in and investment to show that there's real data that shows that this can be successful and worth the time and resources too.
I just had a question with regard to your own well-being or, I don't know, engagement that you see in students and your motivation as well as student motivation. It seems like this would impact all of those things positively, and I'm just curious, especially because I know working in Nebraska with that population, I know that's a tricky business, so I'm sure you have high rates of teacher turnover, so I wonder if you all could speak to that, the 4 of you. Thank you.
I would say it's one of my favorite things to do. I've worked it out high schoolers don't necessarily talk as long as adults. Adults can yap on about their stories for like 20, 30 minutes without stopping. I work it in where we do it everything within a 50-minute class period, and I give them the prompts and kind of time to write or make a mind map about their prompts the day before for about 10 minutes. So I do it in about an hour. Maybe that's not what Narrative 4 suggests otherwise, but that's how I've been able to work it into my classroom. I would say that it is, I love it. The kids who have buy-in absolutely love it. And even the kids who don't necessarily have buy-in like it and understand the importance of it after a while. I had to go to the bathroom, and going to the bathroom during the school day is difficult as a teacher. Went down multiple floors, all the doors were locked, and I asked a colleague to, just kind of get the class going while I was waiting. And I came back, and a student who I'm trying to get to be an ambassador now that he's in college had gotten everyone rounded up, moved all the chairs into a circle, and had really gotten ready to go. So I would say that they really enjoy after the first one is rough. The second one is a little bit better, but I would say definitely into the third and fourth one, if you really make time for it once a month, they love it and they see that it's something that they can start to kind of make their own, rather than something that's a prescriptive process that they're participating in.
I think you pretty much covered everything, but I just wanted to add like one thing. And you asked a specific question about the well-being of the person who is facilitating it, and also the well-being of the students who are, receiving it. And I think it can get emotional, and there's an emotional burden that comes with sharing a story. And if you don't know how to manage it, it can be too much. And I think Narrative 4 does a really good job when you go through the facilitation process, and how to really kind of manage those emotions, manage the space when feelings get too high, and because people share some very powerful stories, and these stories are very personal, and it comes from sometimes it's a trauma, sometimes it's a genocide, sometimes it's really surviving something extraordinary. So being prepared for the space, for your emotion, and also kind of giving a heads up to your student that this is the space that you're expected to get in. And I think giving those information and talking about it with your students will help the process, ease the process. But for me personally, I love stories, and I wouldn't say it's an easy job. I would not say that, but I would say it's, for me it's a duty. Like I have to do it. Like it's the story, like my people, my community, and I can, through my experience, through my stories, I want to elevate other stories too, create the space. So maybe in that sense, I'm not being a little bit selfish there, but I think it's important to be aware of your own emotions when you facilitate, and because you get a lot of stories and different stories at the same time, and it's important to take care of yourself after that. Take some time.
I will say really quick, and I hate to keep like referencing our presentation a little bit, please come. But I'm gonna talk about trauma-informed exit strategies and community agreements. And so I would say that in order to avoid anything that's kind of blowing up either in your face or in the student's face, it's really important to set the stage and agree on that together. And really talk through, sometimes within the first one, it's like, okay, so how do we wanna, communicate? You're really giving them a lot of prompts because they've never done it before, so they don't know what to anticipate. But we oftentimes agree that there will be a content warning. Like if students know that the story that they'd like to share is pretty heavy, we usually just say, content warning, this story discusses blah, 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 and just in a quick topic word. And then we, oftentimes students are like, yeah, it's totally fine if someone wants to step out, they have no problem with that. And so I think it's really important to pre-teach and talk about and agree on those sort of exit strategies, and how do we want to listen to each other, what does that look like? Seniors are often really empathetic about saying like, hey, you know, what does that look like for someone who's neurodivergent, doesn't prefer eye contact? You know, we talk about a lot of these scenarios and situations. So oftentimes the setting up the story exchange takes several days to kind of go through that, but then afterward it's fine. So I would say that if you're not setting that up right, then it can really be taxing. My first year of teaching was really hard with teaching ELL because students were telling a lot of, just candidly amongst each other or to me, stories about surviving the Yazidi genocide, fleeing the different gang violence that's going on in different countries in Central America, and I kind of didn't know what to do with that when I got home. And so I took it with me, which is not healthy. And so I think just knowing that facilitating the story exchange is you doing something and you are only in control of what you are in control of. And so then you kind of just have to, you know, let the space be the space, and then go home after that. Not in a unempathetic way, but in a way where you really have to take care of yourself, where if you're gonna keep doing these story exchanges, you can't ruminate on really difficult stories, just reminding yourself that you facilitated a space for someone to be able to feel that they could be heard there.
Now, I would also add, there's other, you know, like exit strategy, and also I would definitely kind of learn. So one of the theory that is really important to look into, it's a self-disclosure identity theory, where this kind of helps you to really look into when people feel like to disclose. What are the things they need to disclose? And what are the things they have the right to not disclose? How do you foster a space for that self-disclosure to occur? So I think, you know, I mean, maybe that in the facilitation process is very not theoretical, but also it gives you an insight into if you want to learn more about the individual and how the process should be more effective so you can support the people who are participating in this process, is to really look into some of the theories and understanding how they can open up and when they can shut down, and how is that okay and how is that not, you know. I know, like in some of the story exchanges that I have experienced, it was okay to cry, and it was okay to take your time, and it was okay to not share something very, very personal. So it's not expected for you to be extremely vulnerable, and at the same time it's okay. So, but it just having that knowledge, that understanding of how these are at play kind of helps you to be well equipped. So you can, you know, learn about some of those, you know, feelings or those emotions as they come forward. So you know where they're coming from. I think doing some learning about some theoretical understanding of that, and one of them is self-disclosure identity theory.
And I think when you're working with adolescents too, some may be more comfortable in their identity, you know, at the age of 17, 18 than others. It's really important to choose. I try to connect the prompts mostly to my curriculum, but I really try to choose a balance of prompts that can be high or low stakes. And I would just say anecdotally in my experience, I would say it's roughly 50-50 on deep stories that students tell and stories that, like, sometimes kids just want a space where they can laugh. And I think that, like, although the story exchange can be a really great place for students to share difficult, and even, you know, anyone, I've participated in student or story exchanges before, knowing that it can be a joy-filled space too. And I always tell students, because I show a video where people start crying, I'm like, you don't gotta cry. Like, you don't have to just like trauma dump everything here in the circle, and that's totally fine. It can also be a space of joy when you're telling a stupid story about your younger brother, and they really enjoy that as well. And it's just nice to laugh about something common that they can connect with as well.
We're mindful of time. We are close to our end, but I wanted to see if you have one final word that you'd like to offer. But I know we'll have time after for a conversation. Our next panel will allow us to continue some of these great conversations.
Please stay for our presentation.
A little commercial is okay. But I just want to thank our panelists for being with us today and sharing their insights, and for all of you for listening to their stories today. There are some refreshments that everybody's welcome to, and we'll meet again here soon. 20 minutes, correct? 15 minutes. Thank you.
great to meet you.
Send the data along to me so I can send it to our principal. I think our school would be a really good one for inviting us. And
No, it's good for the folks to see, like,